As a result of this, a clear picture is starting to emerge as to the behavior of men and women that seems to transcend national and racial and cultural distinctions, and the same, of course, can be said for men. But in terms of how men are appraising this, for once, men are starting to not only assess statistical evidence on the macro scale of what women and men tend to do in the unconscious ether that is macro scale demographic behavior, but we're also sharing a sustained repository of anecdotal evidence that seems to be following familiar patterns that we no longer can ignore. And I'll give you a personal example of this. Sometimes, I, a pearl slave, has the audacity to buck the monotony of the plantation for a work day or two. And every 6 months or so, I take a personal day and I just hang out at Panera. And I just relax and I surf the internet or whatever. Let me tell you, the sheer amount of these feminine housewives picking out on cars while their husband's away being a good little boy wage slave, the sheer amount of stay-at-home moms there is just astounding. I mean, it's absolutely staggering. It doesn't quite come into focus just how much of a burden your average woman and stay-at-home wife is in society until you have a precious day off to do whatever you want, and you get to see how the other half live. Now, these women, most likely the most pampered and privileged human beings to ever exist, they come in their makeup and their yoga pants and, they drink their little lattes out of their straws that they grasp with their French manicured little fingers. Everything about these women, and I mean everything, it screams out, I am a member of the leisure class. And one can't help be reminded of Imperial China where members of the aristocracy, they grew their fingernails as long as they possibly could as a social cue to signify to the lesser plebeians that they were above having to perform manual labor, like you. And it's the same thing with these women and their manicured fingernails. They wish to show you that they, seeing as how they've acquired a male beast of burden for themselves, are above the trappings of physical or even intellectual labor. You see, all leisure classes operate by selling a lie that they're needed. And with this leisure class, it's the scam of the stay-at-home wife, the, quote, hardest job in the world, which consists essentially of turning dials on male inventions and spitting out kids that they won't ever have to support financially and getting fat. And you see, the process by which we break our servility to this leisure class must absolutely lie in the destruction of convenient fictions. We must take these convenient fictions and these noble lies we've been indoctrinated with one by one and thoroughly re-examine them. Now, what do I mean by convenient fictions and noble lies? Well, I'll give you a couple of examples. Here's something that all my American subscribers should recognize. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Now, this is the pledge I remember repeating every morning verbatim in kindergarten and for years after, all the way up to including in high school, I believe. And it always struck me as wrong on some level. Even at such a young age, I understood that there's something fundamentally off about taking young and impressionable children and forcing them to recite an oath of fealty to God and country. The whole thing just reeked of de-individuation, and it's common knowledge that the mind of a kindergartner is highly impressionable, and it's also no coincidence then that this pledge is recited in the early years and drops off in recitation as we're approaching high school, as our young adult minds are now already saturated to a large degree with generalizations and assumptions we've had foisted upon us in childhood, including, say, a good 10 years of our formative existence reciting an oath to God and country. And looking back on it as an adult, one has to ask why and who thought it was a good idea to take children, brimming with potential, who are essentially human information sponges, neurologically speaking at that age, and to get them to recite this pledge. Who thought this up? I mean, we can assume here that the goal of this daily ritual was intended to foster national cohesion, a Pavlovian nationalism of a sort, which can in fact be extremely helpful perhaps to the development of a nation, but extremely damaging towards the development of the thinking and individualistic mind. You see, now when you get to military age, you have a decade of loyalty to a flag somewhere deep down in your subconscious, and it may just be the deciding factor in whether or not you become blood for the machine someday, for, America and freedom and God and country and all that. And now, as far as religion is concerned, Stardust has discussed this before in previous videos, but I'll give you my perspective on religion here. Now, me, being just a mortal man, I of course cannot tell you with any degree of accuracy whether or not there is some sort of existence after death. I can't tell you that. But I can tell you that our species has created likely hundreds of thousands of deities in our quest for understanding, and we've worshipped them many times as omnipotent beings without bounds or limitations. And throughout our history, there have been countless beings such as this dreamt up in the minds of men, and this puts us in an interesting dilemma because we have to confront that an omnipotent being cannot, by definition, be omnipotent if there exists a second or a third omnipotent being to rival it. An omnipotent being must, by its very nature, be able to overpower any other force or entity in existence and bend it to its will. This means that even if there exists some supreme omnipotent being in the universe, there still have been countless men who went to their graves incorrectly believing that they knew the one true God, the one true omnipotent being, when in reality, they believed in nothing more than a convenient religious fiction that acts as a general human behavior modifier, a noble lie. Therefore, we have to conclude that even if there is a God, organized religions of today and yesterday have been used to control the behaviors of countless billions of human beings, and one need only look at, the Mark Driscolls of today and the so-called men of God telling us to ignore the myriad of risks associated with marriage and to man up and marry those sluts to see that it's still going on today. Religion is a perfect example of a convenient fiction. It suited us well, it provided morals, it provided tribalism and cohesion amongst populations, it curbed destructive behaviors with its moral codes of conduct. But in the end, even if there is an omnipotent being somewhere out there, a god, if you want to call it that, it's still nothing but a crutch for people that do not wish to confront reality and a behavior modifier for civilizations erected on lies. It's an efficient crutch, but it's a crutch nonetheless, and we should never forget that. Because you see, here in the West, all avenues of male expression are curbed and inhibited if they don't have an immediate benefit to society. Society, in the context that I'm currently using it, is synonymous to women and children. One of my favorite movies, one of the most iconic scenes from the cult classic movie They Live, starring Roddy Piper from WWF fame, was the first time he put on these glasses that allowed him to see that an alien race that had invaded planet Earth was secretly holding the human species hostage by mimicking their appearance. Now, these glasses not only allowed him to see which of the humans were really aliens, but it also allowed him to view advertising signs that had been posted all across the city he lived in by these aliens that appeared without the glasses to be, simple human advertising billboards. But when he put on the glasses, the first thing he saw was, a billboard advertisement with the word obey under the human advertisement. And then he looks at the billboard with a woman in a bathing suit, which read, travel to the Caribbean, with this picturesque tropical background. And so he puts on the glasses and he finds the hidden message behind that, and it reads, marry and reproduce. And he looks at a sign advertising a sale in a store, and it says consume. And as he walks down the street, he's bombarded with these same messages: consume, marry, and reproduce, obey, reproduce, marry, reproduce, consume, reproduce, marry, reproduce, consume, eat, sleep, die. Now, I put that little part in there, but you get the point. The symbolism, of course, shouldn't be lost on the thinking man. And as a thinking man, I couldn't help observe that within this sprawling metropolis, where everything seems prosperous and secure and busy, deep down at the core of it all, beyond the trappings of the capitalistic wealth the city was built on, something of immense value was being sacrificed in order to erect this bustling metropolis. There existed a hidden message here. Yes, capitalism creates this vast wealth, of course, nobody's denying it. But it also creates this monotonic, soul-killing existence for the thinking man living in these societies. You may be rich, but you're never alive. You're never truly alive in that existence of the wife and the picket fence and the mortgage and the 2.5 kids, are you? The marry and reproduce and eat, sleep, die, repeat for your progeny status quo, as I've called it in the past, is pesticide for the male soul. The thinking man, he could never be satisfied with it. And it all, again, boils down to the noble lie. War will probably always be with us as a species, granted we don't achieve unlimited free energy or something. And even then, I think we just find new stuff to fight over instead of resources and land. But the method by which war is waged, it reeks of the noble lie that's saturated with the blood of countless male souls sent to their graves in the name of civilizations that have looked at them since time immemorial as expendable pawns to be disposed of unremarkably. I'm reminded of the movie Hurt Locker, when the protagonist he's all done with an extensive tour in the Middle East diffusing IEDs, and he gets home to his wife, and the scene begins with him at home, and his face is in the foreground, and the symbolic static of his television is in the background. And all of these scenes that I'm describing to you are all in the description box for any of you who want to watch them. And the scene then cuts to his wife, whose body language welcomes him after what was, I'm sure, months of having the house to herself, paid for, of course, on his dime. Her body language welcomes him as an intruder, a foreigner in his own home, and he's there, relegating to her news of a suicide blast that killed scores of people he saw in the news, probably some IED, that he potentially could have disarmed himself. And she waits for him to finish talking about that, and she displays zero interest. And finally, she just blithely asks him to help her cut the carrots. And the whole time you could see it dawning on him, the drudgery that this domesticated life offers. And then the scene cuts to him playing with his infant son, asking him if he loves his toys, and specifically his jack-in-the-box. And then he tells his son, or rather, since his son can't understand language yet, he actually tells himself through his son that when you get older, you start to see these things, some of the things that you love, and they might not seem so special anymore. And he uses the jack-in-the-box as an example, and he says, maybe, as you get older, you realize that this jack-in-the-box you love is just a piece of tin and a stuffed animal. And then he says, you end up forgetting the things that you love. And then he says, and by the time you get to my age, maybe it's only one or two things you love. With me, I think it's only one. And the scene then cuts away to him back in a Chinook helicopter, back in Iraq, returning to disarm IEDs in his bomb suit. And what this represented to me was the male desire for adventure and for experience that is unfortunately in a constant battle with the desire for unfreedom, as Stardust refers to it. The desire to settle down, the fear of being alone and all that. And a great many men unfortunately succumb to the fear of loneliness and opt for the great comforting domestication of marriage. But fortunately, I am starting to see more and more, especially in terms of entertainment, an acknowledgement of the excitement and adventure that is lost in one of these domesticated protector-provider relationships. Men, slowly but surely, are starting to wake up to the fact that they are meant for so much more, that their destinies are being impeded even by this vast female liability. Somebody's got to take care of the beautiful retards after all, and we all know women aren't going to do it for themselves in any large measure, and, they can give us children after all, so we might as well. And there and then, in that little mental gymnastic, in that little rationalization, you've signed a piece of your destiny away. You've signed a piece of your potential greatness away. You've signed your adventure away. You've signed all of these things away, at the very least portions of them, in exchange for communion with the vast female emptiness. And so what do? You pack your little garage with little projects, little weekend projects, and that's what your natural born inquisitiveness is reduced to. We can't afford this anymore, can we? We stifle male creativity, which is arguably the most powerful force in the universe in terms of how it can bend nature itself to its will. We stifle it. There are currently hundreds of millions, maybe even billions of men somewhere in some garage tinkering with something, modifying something, building something in their backyard. These men, their collective brain power, if harnessed by a civilization that encouraged technological progression instead of carrying women in exchange for breeding access, these men's collective brain power could be harnessed much more efficiently. We could be living on the moon harvesting helium-3. We could be pumping greenhouse gases into the Martian atmosphere. We could be planning routine lunar and Martian excursions. It's often said that if the Library of Alexandria never burned down, we would have landed human beings on the moon centuries ago. Well, I don't know how true that is, but men having to carry women, the sheer amount of effort we devote to it, to me, it's a slow-motion progressive hindrance being exerted on our species in which an equivalent of hundreds of libraries of Alexandria couldn't come close to matching the sheer amount of human potential squandered in the ceaseless burden the servile male of our species happily accepts in service to the beautiful retards. We can't afford it anymore, gentlemen. We just can't. I'll finish this video by quoting the last sentence of H.P. Lovecraft's The Festival, which reads, quote, "Great holes are digged where earth's pores ought to suffice, and things have learned to crawl that ought to walk." End quote. Society's place for you, men, was to crawl, to serve, to beg, to be utilized. But we're not crawling anymore. We're done crawling. What ought to crawl has learned to walk.